files were never meant to be read by ordinary eyes. Hidden in locked cabinets, stamped with red ink warnings, and buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence, they waited in the dark for decades. These were not battlefield reports or victory announcements. They were the suppressed fragments of stories that governments feared to tell. Each bears the mark of secrecy. Phrases like eyes only, do not declassify, or destroyed after review. They describe events that shook the fragile balance of power during and after the Second World War, but that could not be admitted without unraveling the victorious narrative. As you listen, imagine the smell of dust from forgotten archives, the hum of flickering fluorescent lights in a secure basement, and the cold metallic click of a file box being opened after 70 years. What follows are not myths, not rumors, but chilling accounts drawn from wartime intelligence, intercepted communications, and testimonies buried in silence. This is not the history you were taught. These are the stories governments erased, the shadows of World War II that still haunt the present. Chapter 1: The Forbidden Experiments of Unit 731. In the icy wastelands of occupied Manchuria, far from Tokyo's neon lights and diplomatic offices, a place of nightmares was built under the banner of scientific progress. Known officially as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, its sterile title disguised a sprawling complex outside the city of Harbin. Inside its barbed wire perimeter stood laboratories, prison cells, and furnaces. The men in charge called it Unit 731. The villagers nearby whispered of screams that cut through the night and smoke that carried the acrid stench of burning flesh. The truth would remain hidden until decades later, buried in classified files whispered by survivors, and reluctantly admitted in hushed tones. Commanding this dark enterprise was General Shiro Ishii, a physician whose ambition and cruelty fused into one of history's most monstrous figures. Born in 1892, Ishii studied medicine at Kyoto Imperial University and quickly became fascinated with the potential of biological warfare. By the 1930s, with Japan expanding its empire into China, Ishii convinced military leadership that disease could be as devastating as bombs. His vision became reality with the construction of Unit 731 in 1936. The facility stretched across more than 6 square kilometers, guarded like a fortress, yet cloaked in secrecy even from most Japanese soldiers. What occurred inside was known only to a select group of scientists and officers sworn to silence. The experiments carried out were methodical, cruel, and designed to push the limits of human survival. Prisoners, referred to as logs, were herded into laboratories where they were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. The diseases were left to progress naturally, while doctors monitored every symptom with detached precision. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia. Men, women, and even children were strapped to tables as organs were removed and examined, the victims still breathing. Survivors of these dissections did not exist. Their bodies were disposed of in crematoria, leaving little evidence beyond the notes and photographs carefully filed in Ishii's archives. But Unit 731's horrors extended far beyond the laboratory. Prisoners were forced outside during Manchuria's brutal winters, their limbs doused with water and left exposed until frozen solid. Doctors observed the frostbite process, striking the flesh with sticks to measure how it shattered like wood. Others were sealed in pressure chambers until their eyes burst, or injected with horseblood to test transfusion viability. Grenades and flamethrowers were tested on live captives to calculate blast patterns. Even syphilis was deliberately introduced into prisoners, with sexual assault forced between infected and uninfected captives to study transmission. Every act was justified as research, every life discarded in the name of Japan's war machine. The scale of Unit 731 was vast. Estimates suggest that over 3,000 prisoners died directly within its walls, while field operations killed hundreds of thousands. Ishii's scientists developed plague-infested fleas, which were released over Chinese villages by low-flying aircraft. Entire regions were consumed by outbreaks, leaving civilians writhing in agony. Records uncovered later indicated that these biological attacks alone may have killed as many as 200,000 people. Yet Japan never stood trial for these crimes in the way Germany did. Nuremberg exposed the medical horrors of Dachau and Auschwitz, but in Tokyo, the evidence of Unit 731 was buried under layers of political necessity. The reason for this silence lay not in ignorance, but in deliberate strategy. In 1945, as Japan surrendered, Ishii ordered the destruction of Unit 731's facilities. Buildings were dynamited, records burned, and remaining captives executed. But fragments of data survived, hidden in secure cases carried by fleeing officers. When American intelligence discovered the existence of the experiments, they faced a dilemma. Publicizing the crimes would demand justice at the war crimes tribunals. Yet the United States, now staring down the Soviet Union in the opening years of the Cold War, saw opportunity. The biological data, extracted at the cost of thousands of lives, was unlike anything in American archives. Rather than prosecute Ishii, the US granted him and his staff immunity in exchange for their research. In 1947, under the cloak of Operation Paperclip and related intelligence agreements, Ishii met with American officials. The files reveal that General Douglas MacArthur himself approved the arrangement. The documentation of plague transmission, frostbite resistance, and mass infection tactics were deemed vital for US biological warfare programs. Ishii lived quietly in Japan after the war, never tried, never punished, dying of throat cancer in 1959. His colleagues took positions in universities, corporations, and government institutions, their past erased from public view. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union launched its own investigation. In 1949, in Khabarovsk, a series of secret trials exposed captured Japanese officers who confessed to their roles in biological warfare. The Soviets publicized the atrocities, but the West dismissed the accounts as propaganda. For decades, the story of Unit 731 was reduced to whispers, denied in Japanese textbooks, ignored in American records, and regarded as rumor. Survivors who spoke out were silenced, their testimonies excluded from official war histories. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, when Japanese journalists and historians uncovered sealed archives, that the truth began to emerge. Former guards described the executions. Chinese witnesses recounted the outbreaks. Photographs, medical charts, and construction blueprints surfaced, revealing the industrial scale of the horror. And yet, to this day, the Japanese government has never issued a full acknowledgement or apology for Unit 731's crimes. Official denials persist, even as the evidence lies undeniable in declassified files. The legacy of Unit 731 lingers beyond memory. During the Korean War, reports emerged of alleged biological attacks carried out by the United States, accusations that remain contested. But the parallels to Ishii's research were unsettling. Soviet archives show Stalin demanded access to Japanese biological data, launching his own secret programs. In both East and West, knowledge extracted from atrocities was absorbed into the machinery of the Cold War. It is a reminder that science divorced from humanity can become a weapon, and that justice can be sacrificed for strategic gain. Unit 731 remains one of the most disturbing hidden chapters of the Second World War, a story erased not because it was unbelievable, but because it was too useful. Beneath the layers of denial and silence lies a chilling truth. Thousands were sacrificed, and their suffering was converted into classified documents, stamped with a single phrase: national security, do not declassify. Chapter 2: Operation Werewolf's Shadow Army Erased. As the Reich crumbled in 1945, with Soviet tanks rolling into Berlin and Allied forces advancing across the Rhine, Nazi high command sought survival not only in exile, but in terror. In the final months, Heinrich Himmler authorized one of the most disturbing projects of the war, Operation Werewolf. Cloaked in secrecy and intended to spread fear behind Allied lines, the plan envisioned a hidden army of guerrillas, saboteurs, and assassins that would ensure Germany's defeat was never absolute. The existence of this project was long dismissed as myth, a propaganda tale told by desperate Nazis. But recently declassified OSS memoranda, along with fragments from Soviet NKVD reports, reveal that Werewolf was far more organized and far more dangerous than post-war governments ever admitted. Operation Werewolf was born in late 1944, as the Third Reich recognized the inevitability of its collapse. Conceived by SS General Hans Adolf Prützmann, the program took its name from German folklore, drawing on the werewolf's image of fear and unpredictability. Prützmann, who had studied Soviet partisan tactics in Ukraine, sought to replicate those methods. He envisioned small, autonomous units, trained in sabotage, assassination, and psychological warfare, that could operate independently in the ruins of Germany. Werewolf operatives were drawn from die-hard SS men, Hitler Youth indoctrinated to fanatical loyalty, and police officers willing to kill rather than surrender. Training camps sprang up in forested regions of Bavaria and Austria, far from Allied bombers. Instructors taught recruits demolition, sniper tactics, and coded radio communication. Records show that the SS provided cyanide capsules to each operative, reinforcing the expectation of death before capture. Propaganda broadcasts from Goebbels's ministry urged Germans to resist occupation, warning that werewolves would strike collaborators and traitors without mercy. One infamous leaflet, dropped over retreating Wehrmacht soldiers, declared, "We will never capitulate. Every tree will conceal a sniper, every crossroads a mine, every shadow a werewolf." For the Allies, werewolf presented both a military threat and a psychological one. Reports began to surface in April 1945 of ambushes on American convoys in Hesse and Bavaria. A prominent assassination shook Allied command when Franz Oppenhoff, the US-appointed mayor of Aachen, was murdered by werewolf operatives parachuted in by the Luftwaffe. The assassination was carefully planned. Oppenhoff had been chosen as a symbol of Allied occupation, and his killing was meant to send a chilling message that collaboration meant death. OSS files confirm that werewolf operatives also targeted supply depots, cutting fuel lines, and spreading rumors to destabilize occupied cities. The Soviet Union encountered similar resistance in the East. NKVD reports, preserved in Moscow archives, describe sabotage of rail lines in Czechoslovakia and ambushes against Red Army patrols near Dresden. One Soviet memorandum, dated May 1945, warned that werewolf units could prolong instability for years. Stalin himself was briefed on the possibility that Nazi guerrillas might ally with Ukrainian nationalist groups, forming a broader insurgency across Eastern Europe. Though Soviet propaganda exaggerated the danger, their own files quietly admitted that executions, mass arrests, and collective punishments were deployed to suppress the threat. The Western Allies, facing the same problem, responded ruthlessly. In American-occupied zones, suspected werewolf members were arrested in sweeps that filled makeshift camps. Interrogation records from Wiesbaden describe teenagers, some as young as 15, being accused of sabotage and executed without trial. In Britain's zone, MI6 coordinated with local police to dismantle suspected cells, but many operatives melted into the civilian population. Declassified files reveal a covert program of summary justice, where captured saboteurs were shot under the pretense of battlefield circumstances. To admit that resistance persisted would have undermined the narrative of complete victory, so the records were buried. The truth is that werewolf did not disappear with the Reich. Evidence shows that remnants of the network were integrated into escape routes known as rat lines, the clandestine corridors that smuggled Nazis into South America and the Middle East. Vatican contacts, sympathetic clergy, and intelligence operatives facilitated their flight. Argentina under Perón became a sanctuary for SS fugitives, while Syria absorbed former Wehrmacht officers into its military. Researchers have uncovered indications that some werewolf operatives resurfaced in Cold War conflicts, providing expertise in sabotage to anti-communist militias and paramilitary organizations. What makes werewolf particularly chilling is not simply its violence, but the way governments handled its legacy. After 1945, both East and West dismissed werewolf as a minor, almost imaginary threat. In official histories, it was reduced to scattered acts of desperation, little more than a failed propaganda exercise. Yet classified documents tell another story. In a 1947 MI6 assessment marked Eyes Only, officers concluded that elements of werewolf have not been neutralized, but rather absorbed into broader clandestine networks. Soviet intelligence reached similar conclusions, warning in 1950 that former werewolf cadres now serve under foreign patronage. The erasure of werewolf's history served political purposes. For the Allies, acknowledging a Nazi insurgency undermined the triumph of liberation. For post-war Germany, admitting the persistence of armed fascists threatened the fragile reconstruction. For the Soviets, exaggerating werewolf justified brutal repression, while the West quietly co-opted the skills of former Nazis for Cold War objectives. The Shadow Army was never publicly acknowledged because it was too useful to too many sides. Decades later, fragments continue to surface. In the Bavarian State Archive, a box labeled "Destroy After Review" contained reports of unexplained killings in 1946, attributed in whispers to lingering werewolf cells. Argentine police files mention Germans with forged identities, possessing demolitions expertise far beyond that of ordinary émigrés. In Cold War training manuals for NATO special forces, techniques of sabotage bear uncanny resemblance to Prutzmann's doctrine. The werewolf symbol, designed to inspire terror in 1945, lingered in the playbooks of later conflicts, from Latin America to Afghanistan. Operation Werewolf has been portrayed as a desperate fantasy, the last howl of a defeated regime. Yet beneath the denials lies a darker reality. A clandestine network, born of fanaticism, sustained by secrecy, and repurposed by global powers. It was erased from public memory, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways no government wished to admit. What began as the Reich's ghost army did not vanish in 1945. It was absorbed into the underground of the 20th century, its methods resurfacing wherever fear and shadow warfare were required. And so the story of Werewolf remains a suppressed file, stamped classified, concealed in the archives of both victors and vanquished. Chapter 3. Stalin's Vanished Prisoner Trains of 1945. In the closing months of World War II, as Europe celebrated liberation and Germany's surrender, a darker chapter unfolded in the East. While Western cities rang with church bells, trains full of prisoners, soldiers, civilians, entire families rolled eastward into the Soviet Union. These were not the organized prisoner of war transfers acknowledged in official communiques. They were the ghost transports, convoys that left East Prussia, Poland, and the ruins of Germany, carrying thousands whose names never appeared in any registry again. The trains were sealed, their windows covered, their guards silent. When they reached the endless forests of Siberia or the desolate steppes of Kazakhstan, they simply disappeared. For decades, nothing was admitted. No graves, no lists, no survivors. The trains became whispers in family legends and footnotes in classified Soviet files, marked with chilling codenames like Operation Reprisal and Operation Silence. The origins of these vanished. Transports lay in Stalin's determination to reshape Eastern Europe through terror and erasure. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Allied leaders discussed the future of displaced persons and prisoners of war. While Roosevelt and Churchill spoke of repatriation and reconstruction, Stalin quietly gave orders to the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, to seize not only captured German soldiers but also civilians suspected of collaboration, political unreliability, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Anyone with ties to the Wehrmacht, from nurses to railway workers, could be designated enemy element. The directive was deliberately vague, giving local commanders authority to fill quotas without accountability. The trains began moving in May 1945, just as the guns fell silent. Witnesses in East Prussian villages described Red Army trucks arriving at dawn, rounding up civilians at gunpoint. Families were given minutes to pack, if they were given any warning at all. Those who resisted were beaten or shot. Prisoners were herded into cattle cars, 40 or 50 to a wagon, with no food, no sanitation, and little water. The trains left under cover of night, guarded by NKVD troops who refused to answer questions. Some convoys were recorded crossing the Bug River into Belarus. Others vanished after leaving Königsberg, never arriving at any known camp. What happened inside the trains is known only from fragmentary testimonies. Survivors, rare and scattered, spoke of suffocating conditions, corpses piling in corners, and children dying in their mothers' arms. In some accounts, the guards opened the cars after days only to drag out the dead, leaving the living to continue. Soviet documents confirm that many trains never reached official Gulag intake stations. Instead, entire convoys were diverted to remote forest clearings or abandoned mines, where their human cargo was executed en masse. Witnesses in Siberian villages recalled hearing gunfire near the tracks and stumbling upon unmarked burial mounds decades later. Western intelligence knew more than it admitted. Declassified OSS intercepts mention unaccounted German transports reported by informants in Poland. British officers stationed in Hamburg received letters from families pleading for information about husbands and sons taken east, but never heard from again. Yet the Allied governments, desperate to preserve unity with the Soviets, buried the reports. Publicly, they spoke of reconstruction and reconciliation. Privately, they filed the complaints under no action required. To accuse Stalin of mass disappearances in 1945 would have shattered the fragile alliance and complicated the division of Europe. Silence was the price of political expediency. The Soviet rationale was both practical and ideological. Stalin demanded retribution for the devastation wrought by Germany's invasion. 27 million Soviet lives lost, cities reduced to rubble. The trains were punishment, a form of collective justice against entire populations. But they also served an economic function. Many prisoners who did survive were delivered into forced labor camps, where they rebuilt Soviet industry and infrastructure. German engineers were compelled to work on Soviet rocket programs, while ordinary prisoners felled timber, mined coal, or laid rail lines. For the Soviet Union, these ghost convoys were both vengeance and resource. And yet the records of many transports simply end mid-sentence. One NKVD ledger lists Train 76, departure, Allenstein, May 22nd, 1945, and then nothing more. No arrival, no prisoner count, no names. Another file, partially declassified in the 1990s, notes, transfer conducted as per directive silence, Khabarovsk sector. The remaining pages are missing, removed by censors. The absence itself speaks volumes. Entire trains were erased not by accident, but by design. Their victims left no trace in official archives, as though they had never existed. The tragedy extends beyond the German prisoners. Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, and Ukrainians were also swept into the transports, accused of aiding the enemy or simply resisting Soviet occupation. Families were shattered as men were taken from their homes, women dragged from fields, and children bundled into wagons with them. For decades, their absence haunted communities. Cemeteries held empty graves. Priests spoke of the vanished in hushed tones, knowing that even to ask questions risked arrest. It was only in the waning years of the Cold War that fragments of the truth surfaced. In 1989, as glasnost swept through the Soviet Union, historians gained access to limited NKVD files. Among them were references to special transports not previously acknowledged. Survivors began to speak openly, their stories published in Germany and Eastern Europe. Families traced records and discovered at last that their loved ones had not died in battle, but in silence, consumed by trains that had no destination. The shock was profound. Entire generations realized that the post-war narrative of liberation concealed another crime, one that rivaled the atrocities it claimed to avenge. Today, historians estimate that hundreds of thousands disappeared in these vanished convoys. The true number remains uncertain, clouded by missing records and deliberate erasure. What is certain is that these trains were not aberrations, but part of a calculated policy. Stalin's vanished prisoner trains remind us that victory in 1945 carried a hidden cost, paid by those whose names were erased from both sides of history. They were sacrificed not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of bureaucracy, secrecy, and revenge. The story of the vanished trains lingers as one of the most disturbing unsolved chapters of the war's aftermath. Every now and then, in the forests of Siberia, bones surface from the earth. Locals find fragments of clothing, rusted chains, or a child's shoe. These remains testify to lives erased but not entirely forgotten. Their silence condemns not only those who loaded the trains, but also those who chose to look away. For the vanished, there are no monuments, only redacted files and whispers in forgotten villages. And still, the question hangs in the air. How many trains? How many lives? And how many truths remain hidden in archives yet unopened? Chapter 4. The Secret Pact Behind Dresden's Firestorm. On the night of February 13, 1945, the city of Dresden, long regarded as the Florence on the Elbe, was reduced to ash in one of the most infamous bombing raids of the Second World War. Official records spoke of military necessity, a campaign to cripple German industry and troop movements. Yet the city's cultural heritage, its art-filled museums, its Baroque architecture, and the hundreds of thousands of refugees crammed within its walls told another story. For decades, the destruction of Dresden was shrouded in moral ambiguity. Was it strategic or was it something darker? Declassified archives from both Allied and Soviet sources now point toward a chilling conclusion. Dresden's annihilation was not merely tactical, but part of a secret pact. An act of psychological warfare requested by Stalin himself and quietly endorsed by Allied command. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Red Army had crossed the Oder River, standing less than 50 miles from Berlin. In the west, Allied forces had breached the Siegfried Line. Refugees surged across central Germany. desperate to flee advancing Soviet forces. Dresden, with its ornate spires and minimal military presence, became a gathering point for tens of thousands. The city had no major armament factories, no significant garrisons. It was, by most accounts, a cultural center rather than a military hub. Yet at Yalta, held just days before the bombing, Stalin pressed Roosevelt and Churchill for coordinated strikes against German morale. He argued that the Wehrmacht's last reserves were moving along east-west railway lines, particularly through Dresden. Allied leaders agreed to assist, but the extent of that assistance would exceed military necessity. Operation Thunderclap, a plan first drafted in 1944, had envisioned a massive blow to German civilian morale through concentrated bombing. The plan was shelved as excessive, but in February 1945, under pressure from both political and military leaders, it was revived in modified form. Dresden, previously spared, was marked for destruction. Documents later uncovered in British archives reveal that Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris of RAF Bomber Command received orders phrased with unusual ambiguity. Dresden was to be an example of Allied air power. The vagueness left ample room for interpretation. In practice, it meant obliteration. The first wave struck at 10:13 p.m. when 245 Lancaster bombers dropped high explosives across the city centre. These bombs shattered roofs, walls and water lines, ensuring that fires could not be contained. Less than 3 hours later, a second wave of 529 bombers arrived, dropping incendiaries that ignited the ruins. Within minutes, a firestorm engulfed the city. Winds of hurricane force roared through the streets, pulling oxygen into the inferno. Temperatures exceeded 1,500 degrees Celsius. Civilians huddled in cellars suffocated as oxygen was consumed, while those in open streets were incinerated or hurled into the flames. Survivors described the firestorm as a living thing, devouring everything in its path. Corpses melted into pavements. Families turned to ash mid-embrace. The next day, American B-17 bombers returned in daylight raids, targeting railways but striking survivors, rescue workers, and hospitals. By the time the smoke cleared, Dresden was unrecognizable, a blackened wasteland where ornate cathedrals and museums had stood only hours before. Official casualty estimates were deliberately conservative, set at around 25,000. Yet eyewitness accounts, local records, and post-war investigations suggest the true toll was vastly higher, likely exceeding 100,000. The discrepancy reflects not only the chaos of the time, but a deliberate campaign to downplay the scale of the destruction. Why Dresden? Declassified memos suggest that beyond military calculations, there was a political motive. Stalin had pressed for the bombing as a way to demonstrate Allied commitment to the Eastern Front. By obliterating Dresden, the Allies sent a message to both Germans and Soviets. To the Germans, resistance was futile, no city was safe. To the Soviets, the Western Allies were willing to unleash total devastation to support Red Army advances. In one RAF briefing paper marked "Eyes Only," a chilling phrase appears: "The strike will serve as both military operation and political gesture." Censorship followed swiftly. Photographs of Dresden's ruins were suppressed or classified. Journalists who attempted to describe the carnage in vivid detail were silenced. American reports emphasized railway junctions, ignoring the obliteration of entire civilian districts. British officials later admitted to manipulating figures, reducing casualty estimates to avoid charges of atrocity. Harris himself remained defiant, insisting Dresden was a legitimate target, while Churchill, in a moment of doubt weeks later, privately wrote that the attack seemed a mere act of terror. That memo was quickly withdrawn from public view. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, capitalized on the destruction. Propaganda broadcasts trumpeted Dresden as proof of Allied brutality, a narrative designed to justify Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. Yet secret NKVD reports confirmed that Stalin had explicitly requested the strike to break German morale and stem refugee flows into areas the Red Army had not yet secured. In this sense, Dresden became a pawn in the geopolitical chess game, its population sacrificed to wartime politics. The truth that Stalin requested, the Allies agreed, and the civilians of Dresden paid the price, was far too dangerous to admit during the fragile post-war alliance. For decades, the destruction of Dresden remained a contested subject. Survivors who spoke of the firestorm were often dismissed, accused of exaggeration or Nazi sympathies. In West Germany, remembrance was muted, overshadowed by the need to rebuild and move forward. In East Germany, Dresden's ruins were preserved as a monument to Western barbarism, stripped of context regarding Stalin's role. In Britain and the United States, official histories portrayed the bombing as regrettable but necessary. Only in the 1990s, when Cold War archives opened, did fragments of the hidden pact emerge. Cross-referenced files revealed the quiet coordination between Western commanders and Soviet requests, exposing the political undercurrents behind one of the war's most devastating raids. Even now, Dresden's true story remains difficult to confront. To admit its destruction was not solely military, but political, undermines the narrative of righteous victory. To acknowledge Stalin's role complicates the story of Allied unity, and yet the evidence lies in the margins of classified memos, in the redacted passages of official reports, and in the whispered recollections of survivors who watched their city become a furnace. Dresden was more than a battlefield. It was a warning, a symbol, and a sacrifice concealed beneath the triumphant banners of 1945. The secret pact behind Dresden's Firestorm reminds us that history's darkest moments are often those most carefully hidden. What was called victory was also atrocity, and what was erased from the record lingers still in the ruins, in the unquiet silence of the Elbe's banks, and in the shadows of archives marked "Do Not Release." The files close, but the shadows remain. What began as isolated fragments, secret laboratories in Manchuria, a phantom guerrilla army in the ruins of Europe, ghost trains vanishing into Siberia, and a firestorm ordered from above, forms a mosaic of suppressed history. Each story, when stripped of the silence that bound it, reveals not only the cruelty of war, but the decisions made in its aftermath. Immunity granted to war criminals, insurgents erased from record, prisoners vanished without graves, entire cities sacrificed to politics. These are not tales of victory, but of compromise, deception, and the price of power. Even now, many archives remain locked, their contents redacted, their truths withheld under the familiar stamps of eyes only and national security. The past has not finished speaking, and its voice grows louder with every uncovered file. The chilling stories of World War II remind us that history is not just what is remembered, it is also what is deliberately forgotten. And the question lingers: how many more secrets still lie buried in the classified vaults, waiting for the day when silence finally breaks?